There are those who contend that it does not benefit African Americans to get them into the University of Texas where they do not do well, as opposed to having them go to a less advanced school, a slower track school where they do well. One of the briefs pointed out that most of the black scientists in this country don't come from schools like the University of Texas.
So this
court
court
from lesser schools where they do not feel that they're being pushed ahead in classes that are too fast for them.
Today in the arguments over the Voting Rights Act, Justice Scalia called the Voting Rights Act, a racial entitlement. Got that? Entitlement. The friggin' right to vote now is an entitlement, like Medicaid or food stamps.
To give you a sense of how racist Justice Scalia is, he called the Voting Rights Act, quote, a perpetuation of racial entitlement. He said that in court today.
Today, Justice Scalia, he called the Voting Rights Act perpetuation of racial entitlement. Viewer Donald McCoy tweeted us this one, quote, voting was a racial entitlement before the Voting Rights Act passed. Great point, Donald.
What the Supreme Court heard arguments about this week was a challenge to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, specifically Section 5 of that act, which requires that certain states, mostly in the South but not entirely, have to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department before they're allowed to change their rules around voting.
Understand, think of the irony of this. Alabama is up arguing this right now. 240 times they've had to have the Voter Rights Act come, Section 5, they've had to enforce that against Alabama for Alabama's intent to purge voters, come up with ID scams that were completely bogus, to redistrict, you name it, Alabama's tried everything. Right. 240 times, Section 5 has saved that state, saved the people in that state and given them the right to vote.
Since the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, Congress has decided 4 times now, and by very, very large margins each time, to reauthorize it, to re-up it. They have determined that there is enough of a threat to minority voting rights in this country that this law should remain in place, and that this particular remedy within this law should remain in place.
Now get a load of his perspective. He thinks black people having the same right to vote as white people is racial entitlement.
Congress studied this for months, as recently as 2006. 10 months of hearings. They gathered 15,000 pages of evidence. They held more than 20 hearings in Congress to decide whether this was still a problem and whether this was still an appropriate remedy to the problem. And they decided that, in their judgment, the Voting Rights Act is not just a good law, but a necessary one. All of the senators from all of the covered states who voted on it voted unanimously that it should be kept.
Now, he's been entitled to vote in any damn way that he pleases all his life. But when minorities want to have the same rights, there they go again, wanting their rights, entitlement. Unbelievable.